Namaskaram, everyone. Once again, I would like to thank Raju Uncle for conceiving the idea of this series on Vagya Karas and inspiring me to present such a wonderful series. As a student of music, it provided me with an amazing opportunity to not only understand the history behind these composers, but also take a closer look at their compositions. Having learned many of these compositions since I was young, it allowed me to go deeper into the Sahityam, into the Raga Bhavam, and all of these aspects that I was studying and researching about. And I would really like to once again thank you all for being here and for the opportunity to be here with you all. Before I start my presentation, I would like to offer my salutations to all of my gurus, past, present, and future. Any and all success that I achieve is attributed to them. Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. As Raju Uncle mentioned previously, the last session in this series on Vagya Karas focused on Muthuswami Dikshithar, one of the trinity of Carnatic music composers, or treated as the second of the trinity. Today, we will focus on Shyama Sastri, the third of the trinity. Shyama Sastri is the third and eldest of the famed trinity of Carnatic music composers. Born as Venkata Subramanya as a child, he was called Shyama Krishna by his parents. He is said to have had a darker complexion and yet beautiful, very similar to the Krishna that we see and that's described. And so he was called Shyama Krishna as a pet name by his parents. His birth date is disputed. Sri Subbarama Dikshithar in the Sangita Sampradaya Pradarshini, a very prolific text, mentions that Shyama Sastri was born around 1763 CE, about February 20th. He was born in the sacred place of Tiruvarur. Tiruvarur was known as Kamalalaya Kshetra, or the abode of the goddess Kamalamba. Coincidentally, Tiruvarur is also the birthplace of all three members of the Trinity. Both Tyagaraja Dikshithar were also born there as well. Shyama Sastri's family were actually Smarta Brahmins, originally from Andhra Pradesh, who then migrated to Kanchipuram through a series of events. There, they were actually appointed as the Archakas, or priests, at the Sri Kamakshi temple in Kanchipuram, tasked with looking after the Bangaru Kamakshi idol. Now, this idol was very famed all across the city, was very famed and beloved by its people, as well as by the priests and all of the devotees who came to visit. And this Bangaru Kamakshi was actually made mostly out of gold and was called the Swarna Kamakshi as well. In 1565, after the fall of the Vijayanagara Empire, Kanchipuram was in a state of political turmoil. There were multiple invaders, people trying to gain power. And through that process, the Archakas, or the priests of the temple, were worried for the safety of this Bangaru Kamakshi idol. They were extremely worried and they wanted to protect her at all costs. So they ended up burying all of their temple articles, the special items that they used for worship, and they packed Bangaru Kamakshi up. They packed her up and smuggled her out of the temple in the dead of night, taking her out of the city. After this, they carried the Bangaru Kamakshi idol with them. They settled as nomads. They traveled and lived in forests, settling in different areas, all the while worshiping this Kamakshi, trying to find a place where they could settle for a little bit longer. They reached Tiruvarur with the idol. In 1781, the Archaka families of the Bangaru Kamakshi are settled in Tiruvarur and waiting. And they're spending some time there. And Shyama Sastri's father was called Sri Vishwanatha Shastri. He was one of the main Archakas, priests in the temple. And this is around in 1781, after Shyama Sastri was born. There's about 20 or so years after. The Kaveri Delta and the area once again faced impending invasion. And Sri Vishwanatha Shastri, who was the Archaka at the time, feared for the safety and the protection of Bangaru Kamakshi. And so he went to the ruler of Tanjavur and he asked the ruler of Tanjavur to provide safety and to shelter not only the family but the idol as well. And the Raja approved the request. And so the family shifted actually to Tanjavur around 1783, 1784. Shyama Sastri was about 20 years of age at this time. So for the first 20 years of his life, he's been living in Tiruvarur, working with the Bangaru Kamakshi deity. And when they moved to Tanjavur, he goes along with the move as well. Shyama Sastri's initial training in Telugu and Sanskrit was from his father, and his maternal uncle actually taught him music. He did not necessarily come from a family of musicians, but his practice of it was encouraged. His parents encouraged him to practice, encouraged him to learn, and really encouraged that pursuit in him. He also had a sister called Meenakshi. She passed away very early in her life, but both of them grew up together. They were extremely close, and we'll actually see a little bit of perhaps a connection or an indication of that close relationship a little bit later when we look at his compositions. As Shyama Sastri's father was the main archaka or priest at the Bangaru Kamakshi temple, Shyama Sastri himself began to attend the rituals, began to be a part of the rituals and familiarize himself with them. And as at the age of 20, we know when his life is really taking off, he began to form a very strong connection to the Ambar in this temple. And he regarded her as his mother, and he would talk to her as if she was his mother. So this is the beginning of that relationship that we'll see again portrayed later in the Sahityam. In 1784, a sannyasi from the north, Sangeeta Swamin, actually came to Tanjavur for his annual period of retreat. He took about a 4-month retreat every year and decided to come. And he saw Shyama Sastri. He saw Shyama Sastri's devotion to Ambar. He saw his talent for singing and for composition as well as music. And the Swami decided, inspired by his talent, to train him for a period of 3 years. This is disputed. Some people say he trained for 3 years. Some people say that Shyama Sastri was only trained for 4 months during that actual annual retreat period. But there are differing opinions on that. During this time, Shyama Sastri was initiated into Sri Vidya and Sri Chakra, as well as the practice of Sangeeta Shastra. The Swami who worked with him and who was his guru was well versed in all different aspects of Sangeetam, from Layam, from Ragam, from Sahityam. So understanding not only the melody, but also the Talam, the rhythm, as well as Sahityam or the lyrics. And he was able to impart all of that to Shyama Sastri at this very young age. Before leaving, Sangeeta Swami actually gifted him a variety of musical texts, very, very old musical texts, ancient musical texts, and blessed him, predicting that the young man had the blessing of Kamakshi Devi herself and that he would become eventually a very illustrious individual. One of the other things that his guru actually also asked him to do is he also advised Shyama Sastri to cultivate friendships with eminent musicians and listen as much as he could to the eminent musicians of the day to gather knowledge. Starting with Sri Pachimiriam Adiyappaya. So Sri Pachimiriam Adiyappaya at the time was a very prolific performer, was a scholar and a composer, and he actually standardized many of the aspects of Carnatic music that we know today, such as Raga Alapani and Pallavi rendering. The form of a Ragam Tanam Pallavi, the structure, was actually solidified and standardized by Pachimiriam Adiyappaya. And this is important because we actually see that even though Shyama Sastri did not necessarily learn from him, the association with him and the keen listening and attention that Shyama Sastri paid comes into play much later in Shyama Sastri's own compositions. Out of Pachimiriam Adiyappaya's compositions, one of the most famous is Viriboni, the Bhairavi Atatala Varnam, which is a classic beloved by many students of music, listeners of music, one and all today. Influences can be seen in Shyama Sastri's compositions of Pachimiriam Adiyappaya and his style of singing. Again, we'll see that a little bit later. As the years went on, Shyama Sastri moved on to establish himself. He owned a house, he had a steady income. He eventually succeeded his father as the principal archaka or priest of the temple. He was fairly settled. He married, his wife was a devoted Devi Upasaki like her husband and followed the same discipline, the same devotion, and exhibited the same values that Shyama Sastri did. As Shyama Sastri began to perform more duties as the principal archaka of the temple, he began to have more of an association with the goddess Kamakshi. He began to develop a beautiful relationship, a really beautiful relationship. He treated her like a living goddess, a mother in whom a child would confide in for their mistakes, asking for protection. He would spend hours and hours and hours with the idol, pouring his heart out in songs, imploring her to protect and take care of him, addressing her as mother. Immersed in Sri Vidya Upasana, he would also meditate on her divine form, bursting spontaneously into song in sheer ecstasy. His own compositions, all not only praising Ambar, but entreating Amba to actually come and save him and help him. He maintained very close contact with Tyagaraja and Dikshita, the other two of the Trinity. He actually spent time visiting with them as well as discussing music. It's actually said that a bunch of disciples of Shyama Sastri were on a trip, on a visit to Tiruvarur, and they rendered their teacher's compositions before Tyagaraja, and that is how Tyagaraja heard of Shyama Sastri's compositions and vice versa. Something that's very interesting actually is that Shyama Sastri's second son, Shri Suparaya Shastri, actually was also a composer and composed a song called Ninnuvinagati Gana in Kalyani. He met Tyagaraja and sang the composition in front of Tyagaraja, and Tyagaraja was very pleased, very amazed at his composing abilities, and actually took Subbaraya Shastri as his own student. And we'll also see that Subbaraya Shastri was also a disciple of Dikshtar. And the reason for that is because Shyama Sastri, when he listened to Dikshtar's compositions, he was enamored by the depth of Sahityam, the depth of Ragabhavam, and some of the aspects that we talked about in the last session. Shyama Sastri was so enamored by them that he wanted his son to study with Muthuswami Dikshtar. And so he sent his son to train with Dikshtar for a while as well. What's very interesting is that Subbaraya Shastri, the son of Shyama Sastri, is one of the very few to be a student of not one, not two, but all three of the Trinity. And we'll see again how that legacy kind of continues. There's a beautiful story actually relating an incident between Dikshtar and Shyama Sastri, highlighting their connection, so to speak. One time, Dikshtar's younger brothers, as we know, Chinnaswamy and Baluswamy, were actually visiting in Tanjavur. Dikshtar's father was a well-known composer in his own right, Ramaswamy Dikshtar, and he had composed a Chaukakala Varnam in Sri Ranjani. Chaukakala meaning a medium gati or a medium tempo, not too slow, not too fast, somewhat in a medium tempo. But when Ramaswamy Dikshtar had composed this Varnam, he'd only composed one Chittaswaram, or one Swara passage or solfege passage in the second half of the Varnam. Normally, when we see Varnams today, we see multiple Swara passages kind of building on each other. But for some reason, in this case, there was only one. It was believed that the others were lost or somehow mistaken or something like that. And Shyama Sastri felt this was very bad. He looked at the Varnam and he said, I don't want this composition to die because of somebody else's mistake or just not having the other Chittaswarams. So Shyama Sastri himself composed the second Chittaswaram and actually asked Dikshitar and his brother to complete the Varnam. So Shyama Sastri composed the second Chittaswaram, Chinnaswamy composed the third Chittaswaram, and Muthuswamy Dikshitar actually composed the fourth and final Chittaswaram. And so this Varnam not only encapsulates what Ramaswamy Dikshitar, Muthuswamy Dikshitar's father, composed, but also has elements of the other two members of the Trinity as well. Just as the other two members of the Trinity foresaw the time and day of their demise, so too did Shyama Sastri himself. He predicted his death, both the time and the day, and he actually told his wife beforehand, and his wife being a devout and very devoted to her husband, she was very worried and was very apprehensive. And she actually prayed to Kamakshi that she pass away. She wanted to pass away before that tragedy occurred, before her husband passed away. And so on February 1st, 1827, Shyama Sastri's wife actually did pass away. And Shyama Sastri, upon hearing it, said, 5 days left for me, including this, it'll be 6 days when I pass. And on February 7th, 1827, Shyama Sastri began the morning with Sri Vidya Upasaka and meditated on Kamakshi for one last time. And he asked his son to recite the Karna mantra in his ears before he passed away. At this point, he was about 64 years old. And so we know that this period from 20 to 64 or so is really the prolific period in terms of composing, in terms of learning, in terms of growing. Excuse me for one moment. Shyama Sastri had two sons, the second of which I mentioned earlier. His two sons were Panju Shastri and Subbaraya Shastri. Both sons carried on his legacy, albeit in two different ways. Panju Shastri carried on the legacy of the Bangaru Kamakshi temple, becoming the next Archaka, and his son actually then became the next principal Archaka as well. And it is said that his son and his descendants safeguarded many of Shyama Sastri's manuscripts, the manuscripts that he wrote layam or rhythmic aspects on, the manuscripts that he wrote his songs on, as well as many other aspects of Carnatic music. Subbaraya Sastri carried on the other half of Shyama Sastri's legacy, the musical legacy. He became a renowned composer and scholar in his own right, and again, trained under all three members of the Trinity. His compositions actually contain features of each. Prominent examples of his compositions include Janani Nunavina in Ritigole, the very famous song, Shankarinive in Begada as well. Shyama Sastri did not have as many disciples compared to Tyagaraja or Muthuswami Diksha. He was truly focused on being with Amba, being with the Devi, and simply telling her how he felt. And so he did not have as many disciples as perhaps Tyagaraja or Muthuswami Diksha had, but the prominent disciples that we do have are his son, Subbaraya Shastri, Tarangambadi Panchanath Iyer, and a few others who have handed down the legacy of his compositions. So now that we know a little bit about Shyama Sastri's story, let's take a little bit of a closer look at his compositions. In terms of output, or how many compositions he actually composed, he did not have as many kritis as the other two composers in the Trinity. In total, about 72, 75 compositions. It's disputed to this day. But these compositions include 60 kritis, 4 varanams, 3 swarajatis, and we'll come to those a little bit later, and 5 geetams. 10 of the kritis are in Sanskrit, 4 are in Tamil, and the rest are in Telugu. So we can see this is probably much less than the 400 and even more so that 700 and upwards that we see from Dikshit and Tyagaraja. But these compositions are no less prolific in their own way. Shyama Sastri only used a total of 33 ragams, which if we look at 72 compositions, 33 is a little less than half that. But these ragams were both common and rare. They were mostly rakti ragams, focused on the phrases and the heavy gamakas or ornamentations that are used. Most of his compositions are in a slower tempo. Not all of his kritis are in Vilambakalam or a slow tempo, but a majority are. And that slow tempo allows for the beauty of the ragam to come through, the beauty of the sahityam to come through, as well as the beauty of the gamakams, of the different phrases. His compositions lend himself very well to what we call jarus or slides and kamtita gamakam, or a very heavy shake of the actual note. Some of his ragams are very rare. Raga Chintamani is actually said to have been created by him. There's a beautiful composition considered the hallmark of a composition in Chintamani. We kind of mentioned in previous sessions that if you look at Dikshit's composition in Manirangu, for example, it kind of set the path for that ragam. Similarly here, he really innovated on the Raga Chintamani, and it's said to have been created by him. Growing up, Shyama Sastri also listened to a lot of folk music, and one of the ragas that he heard was Ananda Bhairavi, a beautiful ragam. It actually originated from the folk tradition, and Shyama Sastri took Ananda Bhairavi and reinvented it, brought out new, varied shades of the ragam. Almost 7 to 8 of his compositions are actually in Ananda Bhairavi. It's two to have been his favorite ragam, so to speak, or one of the ragams that he really loved. And he brought out an entirely new flavor. Now, when we think of Ananda Bhairavi, we think of his compositions as the map or the guideline from which we should sing or improvise off of. So we've talked a little bit about the ragams of his compositions, a brief overview, but I do want to talk about the sahityam. So the sahityam of his kritis is simpler, maybe more direct than what we see from Dikshit or Tyagaraja. Tyagaraja, you have philosophical ideas, you have ideas addressed to Rama, we have stories. With Dikshit, you have very intricate ideas of not just philosophy, but also Sri Vidya, Upasaka, and Sri Chakra knowledge as well. But with Shyama Sastri's kritis, the language itself is simpler. It's much more direct. It's filled with this intense emotion for Kamakshi, this intense love, this devotion to Kamakshi as his mother. And Kamakshi is the primary deity of most of his compositions. Although he was a Sri Vidya Upasaka, just like Dikshita, he did not bring those elements into his compositions. He chose to practice Sri Vidya Upasaka, but he did not bring it into his compositions like Dikshita did. Instead, he really focused on emotionality, that pleading, imploring nature, where he implores the divine to take mercy on him and take care of him, and really take care of him as a mother takes care of her child. Most of his kritis are addressed to Kamakshi, but some are addressed to other forms of Devi. There are multiple other forms of Devi that he has composed on. He's also composed a beautiful Navaratna Malika, or a garland of 9 gems, a group of 9 kritis on Madurai Meenakshi. upon actually someone's request. From a rhythmic standpoint, Shama Sastri was fascinated by rhythm, was fascinated by what we call chapu talams. And so I will demonstrate. When we see chapu talams, we think of Mishra chapu, which is sort of takita, taka, dimi, or 3 and 4. We also have kanda chapu, which is taka, takita. Those talams actually originated from a folk tradition. And one of the theories is that growing up, Shama Sastri actually had very fond memories of the temple in Tiruvarur, and they performed bhajane there. They performed a variety of folk songs there. And growing up, that's what he was inspired by. And a lot of his compositions feature chapu tarams, much more so than some of the other composers. And he also played around with that idea of chapu and the idea of layam as well. At times, his compositions actually allow for 2 different talams to be applied. For example, if we take a relatively well-known example in Saveri, if we look at Shankari Shankuru, it has a natural rhythm of Rupaka talam, but the suggestive rhythm of Adi talam Tishragati. So, for example, give me a second. One of the ways that it is sung is Shankari Shankuru Chandramukhi Akhilandeshwari, which is in Adi Talam Tishragati. But many also sing Shankari Shankuru Chandramukhi Akhilandeshwari in Rupakam as well. So we see that inherent focus and emphasis, but also play with rhythm that he does. And you can see this in multiple of his compositions. Certain of his compositions will sound lend itself better where the pallavi and anupallavi, or the first and the second half, are actually representative of a certain type of composition. Whereas the charanam will be representative of a different layam composition. And so understanding those when you sing them as well makes a little bit of a difference. One of the other interesting things with chapu talams that I found very interesting was that Shama Sastri is probably the first that we know of to use viloma chapu. When we see Mishra chapu in performances today, we see takita, taka, dimi. Well, Shama Sastri actually turned it on its head and sang it as viloma chapu. Also taka, dimi, takita. And on the outset, this might not seem like a major change when you're singing, considering the sum total is the same. But it does make changes to how the composition is sung, what is sung, and where the sahityam actually falls. And to innovate with that talam itself within the bounds of that talam is something that is very beautiful. So Ninnu Vinagamari is actually an example of this, as well as Nannu Brovularita, which I will sing just the pallavi of now. Nannu brovu lalita Nannu brovu lalita vegame 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 nannu brovu lalita gada chala ninnonera nammiyunna vaadu gada bhakta kalpatananu provu dalita vegame jala ನಿನ್ನೋನೆರ ನಮ್ಮಿಯುನ್ನ ವಾಡು ಗದ ಭಕ್ತ ಕಲ್ಪದಲತನು ರೋವು ಲಲಿತ So not only do we see that this composition is in Viloma Chapu once again, that idea of four first, then three, and you'll see how this item has been beautifully composed to match that. We see another aspect as well here, that this song is in the ragam Lalita, perhaps not a very common ragam, but a ragam full of bhakti and rakti, a rakti ragam as we say, something that is full of um, very melodious and gamaka laden phrases, and you can actually see that in the pallavi. You have these sangadis that build on each other consecutively, even though the song is sung at a relatively slow pace. You'll hear the sangadis build, and you'll hear the interplay with layam, with rhythm, as he starts certain sangadis on the end of a talam, certain sangadis before, and certain sangadis in the middle of the seven, and creates a whole landscape that at the same time does not take away from the immense pleading that he is doing for Lalita, for Ambal in this case. Shama Sastri was also actually a Pallavi Vidwan, and this is again focusing on the association with Pachimiriam Adiyappaya, who was a very famous Pallavi Vidwan. Shama Sastri learned the art of singing Pallavi and was very comfortable. And this is again where we see how Ragam Tana Pallavis today are some of the most intricate, complicated layam exercises that we see, or exercises in rhythm. And we see that not only was Shama Sastri well versed in rhythm and understanding rhythm, but at the same time, because of this association, he was able to learn even more. And this is a big distinction. This sets him apart from the other two members of the Trinity. Dikshar and Tyagaraja were not known to work in the Pallavi style. They were not known to be very prolific in that area, which Shama Sastri was. So it sets him apart and kind of establishes his stamp and his uniqueness as more of a layam expert and exponent. Shama Sastri was also very adept at building swarakshara sahitya passages, excuse me. Swaraksharam literally means where the swaram actually matches the akshara or the letter. For example, the identical sounding of padasarara actually has the swarams padasa. From the Kriti Devini Padasarasa in Kambodji. So he's created the ragam and the sangadi to match the sahityam, which is a very beautiful thing. One kriti that I wanted to focus on and bring to light, especially in the time of COVID, is actually the kriti Durusuga. Durusuga and Aditalam, regarded as a classic composition. We have the Pallavi, which starts with a Swarakshara pattern of that is Durusu. Again, matching that Swaraksharam idea in one of the Sangadis. And when you return to the Pallavi, actually, going back to the meaning, there is a faster, more Madhyama Kalam phrase. And we can see how that Madhyama Kalam phrase indicates that hastiness that he has, Durusuga, um, as he's pleading to the mother, which is a beautiful thing. And we can understand that the sahityam of this Pallavi truly says, please show mercy quickly, Durusuga, and make me free of any disease. Santana Maroga. Again, relating to the idea of COVID, a beautifully apt kriti, considering our current time period. It's truly a plea to Amba to actually make sure that you are free from any ills, and make you feel comfortable. So I will sing a little bit of that as well. Once again, this kriti is also in Saveri, a very Bhakti ragam, a very phrase-laden ragam with heavy phrases involving many gamakams as well. And you'll see how beautifully Shyama Sastri has taken the gamakams and attached them to the sahityam. I will sing the charanam of this Kriti. Dhara dharavimira gaja lasita sarasa kavita nijita dhara dharavimira gaja lasita sarasa kavita nijita saragana sarasita darahasita darahasita saragana sarasita darahasita Variruga Varivadanochita Vagisha Vinota Britanada Amba Variruga Varivadanochita Vagisha Vinota Britanada Amba Variruga Varivadanochita Vagisha Vinota Britanata Narayani Shama Krishna Nutana Manavini Vini Giri Suta Narayani Shama Krishna Mudana Manavini Vini Giri Suta Narayani Shama Krishna Mudana Manavini Vini Giri Suta Narayani Shama Krishna Mudana Manavini Vini Giri Suta Sarvochanayana Nata Jana Palini Vani Vedamulu Muralidaga Sarvochanayana Nata Jana Palini Vani Vedamulu Muralidaga Nitarulevaru Manavivinu Kripasalupa Parakusalupa Radiyani Vipodu Nitarulevaru Manavivinu Kripasalupa Parakusalupa Radiyani Vipodu Duru Suga Kripajoji Santatamaroga Drida Shariramuga Salupunanu 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 Oh, So we can see a few things in this kriti. Not only do we have these very gamaka laden phrases, we see in the Pallavi itself we have that kind of interplay between a slower sangati and a faster sangati. Um, we have a very faster sangati right before Durusuga to highlight come quickly, come fast as well. The Sharanam is a beautiful description of what the Ambar looks like. The one who has a very sweet smile, the one who has a beautiful face, who has a bunch of lotuses in her hair. And it all comes back to, all of this description comes back to Please listen to my appeal. Please listen to me. Please take care of me. Show me mercy. And that really is the shining theme that goes through almost all of Shyama Sastri's kritis, this intense pleading pattern, um, to ask Amba to take care of him, protect him, and really be there for him in all aspects of his life. I can also see very classic Saveri Ragam patterns. Na, 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 sari, ga, sari. Um, we have similar repetition of certain lines happening. Dara Hasita comes twice, the one which has a beautiful smile on her lips. And we see in the Pallavi as well, the idea of Salupu Nanu, Salupu Nanu, Salupu Nanu comes 3 times. Again, highlighting the intensity of his emotions. Shama Sastri was not feeling this on a beginner level. He was on a lower level. He was truly feeling this emotion in a very strong way. And this kriti brings out the essence of the Raga Saveri itself and is truly a classic. The last type of composition I want to touch upon is actually the Swarajatis. And the reason why is Swarajatis are a very specific type of composition. And the 3 Swarajatis that Shyama Sastri composed were revolutionary. No one had composed Swarajatis like that in the past. And they're regarded as 3 crown jewels in their own right. He actually converted a dance form. Swarajati was originally a dance form because it had jatis or bol passages, and he converted that into a more musically suitable form by actually altering the format to be swara sahitya. And you'll see that again in a lot of his compositions. Even Durusuga actually has a Chichaswaram in the Anupallavi, with a matching sahityam, which I sang at the end of the charanam. So he created this idea of swaram that follows a certain pattern and sahityam that exactly mimics that pattern. And from a composer standpoint, it's very difficult to make all of the words fit in an appealing manner, in a manner that does not seem rushed or hurried, but in a manner that makes sense. And this was something that Shyama Sastri really innovated on. The 3 Swarajatis of notable import by Shyama Sastri are Rave Himagiri in Todi, Kamakshi Nipada in Yadukula Kamboji, and Amba Kamakshi in Bhairavi. Amba Kamakshi is most probably the most well known out of the 3, and Amba Kamakshi actually bears a lot of similarity to Pachimiriam Adiyappaya's Bhairavi Viriboni Varnam. And again, we can see that influence there. One of the beauties of the Amba Kamakshi Bhairavi Swarajati is that each Chittaswaram is actually there are 8 Chittaswarams, and each Chittaswaram actually starts on a corresponding note of the Arohanam Avarohanam of Bhairavi. So we have the first Chittaswaram starting on Kirsa or lower Sa, and then Ri, Ga, Ma, Pa, Da, Ni, and so on. It's interesting to note that in Bhairavi, we don't start in some of those swarams in certain phrases, and yet Shyama Sastri has composed it in such a beautiful manner that it doesn't seem like a phrase out of sorts for Bhairavi at all. And so I wanted to touch on those 3 Swarajatis since they are such a huge part of his compositions and are a huge form that he actually gave. Normally, Swarajatis are not sung in concerts, and these 3 very often are sung in concerts with improvisations, especially Bhairavi and Todi. The very famous line in Bhairavi, Shyama Krishna Sahodari, the last Chittaswaram, the Sahityam is improvised upon and actually used for Naravilan Swaram as well, proving that not only did Shyama Sastri create compositions that reflected a ragam, but also lended themselves to improvisation. And this makes sense, seeing as he was not only a composer, but also a Pallavi Vidwan, well versed in Manodharma Sangeetam as well. In conclusion, although Shyama Sastri has composed perhaps less quantity in terms of numbers than the other members of the Trinity, he's no less prolific in any way. His compositions, the Sahityam reflects a simplicity beyond words, a pure devotion beyond all bounds, something that is both beautiful and astonishing at the same time. And he's able to weave that simplicity of that pure devotion along with rhythmic aspects as well as Raghabhavam to create a seamless transition, described by many as a complete musician. Shyama Sastri, even though his compositions were few in number, 70 compared to 400 and compared to 700, his songs are just as important and his songs are just as beautiful and provide the same transportative feeling that you get from listening to a Dikshitar Kriti or a Tyagaraja Kriti, and in some ways more so because of the simple language of this true call to Amba. In this series of Vagyakaras, I did want to take a second. We have looked at all three members of the Trinity, and I did want to take a second summarizing sort of what we know about them and how these three have kind of paved the way for many other Vagyakaras after them. So in comparison, all three were born in a very short span of about 14 years, all three again born in Tiruvarur, proficient in multiple languages, so very learned, not just in musical aspects, but also in Sahityam, and aspects like Sri Vidya and other technical aspects as well. All three were obviously spiritually inclined and regarded music as a means to worship the divine and attain moksha. Whether that's through Tyagaraja telling Rama's story through his kritis, or that's Dikshitar discussing the Sri Vidya Upasaka and the characteristics of the Navagrahas in his kritis, or whether it's Shama Sastri pleading with Ambar to come save him and take care of him. They were all very spiritually inclined. They did not like the idea of praising mortals, and they were not bound by royal patronage. They chose to do their own thing, march to the beat of their own drum. All three were musical geniuses in their own right, but we've seen that each had their own virtue. If Tyagaraja is said to have blended raga and bhavam seamlessly, Dikshitar is said to have created beautiful raga portrayals that are unto their own, even taking Hindustani music and Western music influences that we've seen. And Shyama Sastri is tutored to have been the one who not only put together complex gamakams for Rakti ragas, but also melded them very seamlessly with rhythmic phrases. So as we see, all three of these composers, or Vagyakaras as we're calling them, contributed an immense amount to Carnatic music. Their contribution cannot be understated, and they've paved the way for so many other composers who followed from a Sahityam standpoint, from a Bhavam standpoint, a Ragam standpoint, and a Layam standpoint. All three were truly complete musicians and very much worthy of the title Vagyakara as well. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. I will sing the Hanuman Chalisa as well here in a minute, if you'll excuse me. Shri Guru Charan Saroj Raja Nij Mana Mukura Sudari Parano Raghubara Bimalaya Sajodayak Palachar बुद्धिहीन तनु जानिके सुमिरो पवन कुमार बल बुद्धि विद्या देहु मोहि हरहु कलेश विकार जय हनुमान ज्ञान गुण सागर जय कपीस तिहु लोक उजागर राम दूत तुलित फलधामा अंजनी पुत्र पवन सुत नामा महावीर विक्रम बजरंगी कुमति निवार सुमति के संगी कंचन वरण विराज सुभेशा कानन कुंडल कुंचित केशा हाथ वज्र और ध्वजा विराजे कांधे मूंज जनेऊ साजे शंकर सुबन केसरी नंदन तेज प्रताप महाजगवंदन विद्यावान गुणी अति चातुर राम काज करिबे को आतुर चरित्र सुनिबे को रसिया राम लखन सीता मन बसिया सूक्ष्म रूप धरि सियहि दिखावा विकट रूप धरि लंक जरावा भीम रूप धरि असुर संहारे रामचंद्र के काज सवारे लाए सजीवन लखन जियाए श्री रघुवीर हर्षि उर लाए रघुपति कीन्ही बहुत बड़ाई तुम मम प्रिय भरत सम भाई सहस बदन तुम रोज सिखावे अस कई श्रीपति कंठ लगावे सनकादिक ब्रह्मादि मुनीश नारद शारद सहित ईश यम कुबेर दिगपाल जाते कवि कोविद कही सके कांते तुम उपकार सुग्रीव ही कीना राम मिलाय राजपद दीना तुमरो मंत्र विभीषण माना लंकेश्वर भय सब जग जाना जुग सहस्त्र जो जन पर भानु लील्यो ताहि मधुर पद जानु प्रभु मुद्रिका मिली मुख माहे चल दिलांगे गए अचरज नाहि दुर्गम काज जगत के जेते सुगम अनुग्रह तुमरे तेते राम दुआरे तुम रखवारे होत न आज्ञा बिनु पैसारे सब सुख लहे तुम्हारी शरण तुम रक्षक काहू को डरना आपन तेज समारु आपे तीनों लोक आंखते कापे भूत पिशाच निकट नहीं आवे महावीर जब नाम सुनावे नासे रोग हरे सब पीरा जपत निरंतर हनुमत बीरा संकट से हनुमान छुड़ावे वचन ध्यान जो लावे सब पर राम तपस्वी राजा तिनके काज सकल तुम साजा और मनोरथ जो कोई लावे सोई अमित जीवन पल पावे चारों जुग प्रताप तुम्हारा है प्रसिद्ध जगत उजियारा साधु संत के तुम रखवारे असुर निकंदन राम दुलारे अष्ट सिद्धि नवनिधि के दाता असबर दीन जानकी माता राम रसायन तुम्हारे पासा सदा रहो रघुपति के दासा तुम्हारे भजन राम को पावे जन्म जन्म के दुख बिसरावे अंत काल रघुबरपुर जाई जहाँ जन्म हरि भक्त कहाई और देवता चितन धरई हनुमत से सर्व सुख करई संकट कटे मिटे सब बीरा जो सुमिरै हनुमत बलबीरा जय 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 हनुमान गोसाई कृपा करो गुरुदेव की नाई जो सत बार पाठ कर कोई छूट ही बंदी महासुख होई जो यह पढ़े हनुमान चालीसा होय सिद्धि साखी गौरीशा तुलसीदास सदा हरि चेरा की जय नाथ हृदय मांदेरा पवन तनय संकट हरण मंगल मूर्ति रूप राम लखन सीता सहित हृदय बसौ सुरभूप सियावर रामचंद्र की जय पवन सुत हनुमान की जय उमापति महादेव की जय राधावर कृष्ण चंद्र की जय बोलो रे भाई सब संतन की जय कि अपने गुरुदेव की जय कि अपने माता पिता की जय. Thank you. Raju uncle, over to you.
Can you do Mangala Shlokas, please? And then
Absolutely.
Dr. Biram afterwards you.
Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Hari Om.
Thank you so much, Jahnavi. As usual, it's beautiful, beautiful, so enjoyable and educational. Thank you. We have 8 more minutes for questions, comments.
Shamala ji is there, Lakshmi Garu is there. Shamala ji, you are muted.
Okay, Jahnavi, I am Shamla Anji, and I have heard you before. So this was a very, very beautiful presentation of Shyama Shastri. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I have only a couple of things to add, which you already know. I have learned that Ananda Bhairavi was Shyama Shastri's favorite raga. and he has written several kritis in Ananda Bhairavi Raga, right? Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
so it's actually included as his favorite. Yes.
Right, Ananda Bhairavi Raga. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up was his son, Subbaraya Shastri, right? And he was also a very famous musician, and who has composed this very classic song on Devi Janani Ninnuvina in the Riti Gaula Raga, right? Which has been made famous by M.S. Subbulakshmi and other great composers. It's such a beautiful, beautiful kriti, right? So enjoyable in such a beautiful raga. And also going back to the Swarajadi, I am so glad you mentioned the Swarajadi. It is said that if a musician could do the Swarajadi of Shyama Shastri, that is really an asset to that musician. You know, not everybody can sing the Swarajadis of Shyama Shastri, completely well, unless he's really an adept on it. Again, M.S. Subbulakshmi, Chammaguri Srinivasa Iyer, and such great, great people has done this Saraswati well, right? So for a student to accomplish and sing that Saraswati, especially the Bhairavi one is the most popularly sung Saraswati, right? It is really an asset. So I thought I'll mention that. That's all. It was a very good presentation. Thank you, Janavi.
Thank you so much.
Very good presentation, Janavi. Your flow of talk is like your Ganges, which Bhagirath takes to their ancestors by going through the Jana Maharshi's years and flows real quick and fast. So your thought process and singing is like that. That's truly amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Swaraganga.
Janvi, we really enjoyed your presentation. Fantastic singing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Auntie.
Any other comments?
Dr. Biram, if I can take a couple of minutes.
Sure, Roger.
Yeah. Jahnavi, you have introduced this Trinity and then ignited so much of interest. Now we are enjoying so many Dikshitar Kritis and more so the Navagraha Kritis by Shyamala Aunty. So Shyamala Aunty has taken up that series and so we are enjoying. We are now going to do Sukra next by Shyamala Aunty. Then Shyamala ji is doing such a wonderful job. And then you inspired Dr. Biram to do a session on Ramadasu. So, so Ramadasu, so Dr. Biram has done a wonderful job. Then Lakshmi Garu has done Kshetra Sangeetam of Swati Tirunal. Swati Tirunal. So we were going to ask the next one. I don't know whether you want to do an Purandaradasa or I don't know what you have in your mind.
I haven't thought about it yet, but to hear, I was originally going to do Swati Tirunal, but if somebody's already done it, I'm happy to take requests for the next composer.
Lakshmi Garu, what do you think? Should we ask for Purandaradasa next?
So Sri Purandaradasa is definitely the father of Carnatic music. And there is a very interesting life story for him as well. So I think that's a really great topic to talk about. Sri Purandaradasa was not a musician. He was a merchant, and he was, so there's a lot of good story that people will enjoy listening to, how he became Purandaradasa and a Carnatic music singer. So, and of course composer. So he's considered as the Pitamaha of Carnatic music. So let's go with the Sri Purandaradasa then.
Of course,
Thank you.
happy to do that.
So that will be in May. And then I think Jyoti has requested Dr. Biram to do a session on Annamacharya.
Oh, very nice.
Dr. Biram, I hope you obliged or you're thinking about it.
I'm thinking about it.
Okay. Then as Venkatrao Garu and then few others have requested me, I know you send so many links and your dad sends me so many links, and then we just, if an hour of just your singing, now that you introduced all these great Wagekaras, so we just, I'm sure everyone will be delighted with that proposal of just,
Of course.
45 minutes of your concert for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Happy to do that.
So those are my comments and requests. And Shamakrishna, he addresses Devi as a Sahodari. So is that the connection with his sister, with Meenakshi?
Yes,
I sense
it is. So that is the connection that indicates, he says Shamakrishna Sodari or Sahodari a lot in his songs. And so we take that to refer to the strong connection that he had with his sister, because that was his closest confidant growing up. And so we take that, even she passed away very early. So we take that as a clue that is his connection with his sister. Yes.
Yeah. And his lyrics, as you said, are so simple, and it looks as if he's speaking to Devi. And then, but I heard his musical fervor, from you, and it's so rich, I guess. Thank you.
There's also, I don't know if Janvi already mentioned it, I may have missed the first part of it, but there's also a legend to say that Sri Muthuswami Dikshita was at the temple, and a young girl wearing, really silk outfits and lots of jewelry and everything brought milk to him, saying that, big brother, mom sent the milk over to you. And so he said, okay. And he was a little bit shocked that the little sister came all dressed up, wearing ornaments and everything. So when he got home, he asked his parents, why did you send her, wearing all these ornaments? And the parents said, we didn't send her anywhere. The sister was never sent over there. So it was really Devi that actually gave the darshan to him as a little girl.
Wow. Think we are right on the hour. If no other questions, Jahnavi, thank you very much again. Looking forward to hearing from you next month.
Thank you so much.
And good night, everyone. Shubharatri. And
Shubharatri.
tomorrow, what do we have tomorrow, Raju?
Tomorrow, hopefully, Sriram Sarvatam can come in, and
Okay.
so if not, we will do something extempore.
Okay. Shubharatri, everyone. Thank you.
Shubharatri, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Janvi. Subharatri.